I've mixed feelings talking about sexual harassment at the start of a new school year. On one hand, I don't want first year students who are just embarking on a long academic career thinking that sexual harassment is a ubiquitous scourge that will plague their everyday experience, because it's not. But on the other hand, it is still a big problem, the Me Too movement notwithstanding, and it is important to know how to react to sexual harassment from day one. While the harassment of patients by healthcare providers and vice versa both occur and are worthy of discussion, this video will focus just on harassment that occurs between the members of the broader healthcare team, including the harassment of students by faculty. There are two huge disclaimers to this video. First, I'm not a lawyer, and nothing I say in this video should be construed as legal advice, even when it sounds like legal advice. Second, I have no specific training in dealing with sexual harassment. So you might ask, if I have no specific training, why am I talking about this if it's not an area of expertise? Well, to be honest, it's because no one else is going to. At least in the US, the only formal training you'll likely ever get on preventing and reacting to sexual harassment is that which is legally mandated, which you won't be exposed to until after you've graduated from school, and even then, it will be largely unhelpful. You may think that this is not a relevant topic for you, and this is not why you're here on Strong Medicine on this YouTube channel. But sexual harassment is one of those things that many assume is not relevant until one day, without any warning whatsoever, it becomes very relevant. A personal story here is I remember one incident as a resident. I was minding my own business, trying to get my work done on the wards, and I came across a fellow who's being harassed by an attending. This incident lasted less than a minute, and at the time I was stupid and naive, and I didn't completely recognize what was going on, and at least not at the time, in the moment that is. And I wouldn't have known what to do if I had fully recognized it, so I did nothing. And years later, once I knew that woman much better, I talked to her about what I had observed that day, and I learned that I had only glimpsed a tiny moment of the pervasive and damaging harassment to which that man had subjected her to for years. And I'm not suggesting that I, as a resident and a brief bystander, that somehow I could have stopped it, but maybe if I more quickly recognized what was going on and reported it to the appropriate person, the outcome could have been different. During my subsequent time in academic medicine, over the last 15 plus years, I've seen the full spectrum of harassment, ranging from a seemingly one-off inappropriate comment to literally Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein type egregiously criminal behavior. I've witnessed a full spectrum of reactions by victims, and I have seen the full spectrum of outcomes, from the situation being ignored by all parties, hoping it just goes away, to colleagues being fired, arrested, or in one case taking his own life mid-investigation. I know some of you are probably thinking, oh, but, Dr. Strong teaches at Stanford. This is just a Stanford thing, right? But talking to faculty from other schools, from reading stories in the media and online, and to be honest, from looking at hard data collected from institutions of higher education across America, I can tell you that Stanford is kind of middle of the road with this. Sexual harassment and sexual assault in medicine and at academic institutions, they still remain a problem everywhere. I'm going to break down the remaining info in this video into three general topics. First, I'll define sexual harassment and sexual assault, which unfortunately I still need to do. In 2021, it should be impossible for a perpetrator to hide behind the claim that I didn't know such and such was harassment. But perpetrators, they still try to do that. Second, I'll give advice to victims of harassment. And third, I'll give advice to bystanders who witness harassment. What is sexual harassment? Sexual harassment is a broad term that describes unwanted sexual and romantic advances and other unwanted verbal and physical behavior of a sexual nature in the workplace or learning environment. Words and behavior do not need to be directed at a specific individual to be considered harassment. And while the intent of the harasser is not totally irrelevant, the impact on the victim is weighed much more heavily. Harassment can include requests for sexual favors, repeated requests for dates despite prior rejections, jokes referring to sexual acts or sexual orientation, discussion of sexually explicit stories, the display of sexually explicit objects or pictures in a shared workspace, or the transmission of sexually explicit language or photos by email or text. Once again, even if someone is not intending to harass another person, if whatever is being done is of a sexual nature and is unwanted, it is probably harassment. How does this differ from sexual assault? As the term is used within the United States, sexual assault involves some form of non-consensual physical contact of a sexual nature. In different jurisdictions, sexual assault may legally go by different names, such as sexual battery, or it may be subdivided into different categories. Broadly speaking, sexual assault may refer not just to penetration of the victim's body, but it also refers to fondling, including that done through clothing. For example, there was a post in the last year on Reddit in which a student, a medical student, discussed a situation in which an attending physician had put his hands around her waist and deliberately pushed his groin against her backside while observing a procedure. And this was referred to by the student describing the story as sexual harassment. Even though everything was through clothing, in the US, this is still sexual assault, a very serious crime. So now let me talk about the victims. I appreciate that not everyone agrees with the use of that term here, preferring survivor, particularly in cases of sexual assault. But victim is the most common term that's used, including what's used in court. So that's what I'm going to use for today. If you're the victim of harassment, what should you do? The first thing is to document everything in as close to real time as possible. Who said or did what when, and who else potentially witnessed it. This means every conversation, every meeting, save every relevant text and email. Writing what happened on paper is better than nothing, but it's best for there to be some form of digital timestamp that will prevent someone from claiming that you just made it up months or years later. The easiest thing to do is to send an email to yourself, provided that your account is secure. But regardless of how you do it, it's important to have a record that can be compared to other corroborating evidence down the road. Even if you don't think that you want to file a complaint right now, the harassment could continue. A friend could later get harassed by or assaulted by the same person, or you might just change your mind about it over time. So just document everything. The next thing I recommend to victims is talk to somebody about what happened. Even if you think of yourself as a rock, you will need emotional support. Who should this person be? It could really be anyone who you trust, but there's one huge caveat to that, and that is faculty members at many institutions can be what's called mandatory reporters. This means that if they learn of harassment or assault of a student or trainee, or sometimes of a colleague, even if they learn of it indirectly, or even if the victim objects to it being reported, a mandatory reporter must nevertheless report it to the institution or risk serious disciplinary action themselves. Whether or not such policies are a good idea, that's a whole other discussion. But I found myself in this situation more than once. If you are a victim and you are considering discussing your situation with a faculty member, it's okay to first ask them if they are a mandatory reporter. And if you are a faculty member watching this video and you know that you're a mandatory reporter yourself, and you think you may be imminently learning about sexual misconduct from one of your trainees, I personally think it's appropriate, and I would even recommend it, to remind them of your status so your trainee can make as informed a decision as possible of what to disclose to you. In my opinion, victims of harassment and assault should retain maximum autonomy on how their situation is handled, but I do know that not all faculty and administrators agree with that approach. Next point for students. When it comes to harassment and assault, do not assume the school is on your side here. The primary responsibility of the school is to itself, including its reputation. Now, this doesn't mean that you won't find sympathetic and caring individuals in the dean's office who individually want to do the right thing. Those people are definitely there. But even the dean's office is beholden to the institution who is composed of the president and the provost, trustees, faculty senate, alumni, other donors, and Nobel Prize winning faculty who have big labs and big reputations themselves. One student's personal well-being is not the top priority for most of those people. Likewise, for residents, do not assume the GME office is your friend here either, for many of the same reasons. And for faculty and other employees, HR is most definitely not your friend. HR will act to defend the institution. If it's in the institution's best interest for a perpetrator to be fired, HR will do what they can to achieve that. And if it's in the institution's perceived best interest for a perpetrator to remain where they are, HR will work towards that goal instead. So, if you're an intern accusing a department head of sexual misconduct, you will find yourself in a nearly unwinnable position unless you're willing to involve the media, the courts, or the police, which unfortunately may still not be in your personal best interest in the long run. So, if you can't trust the dean's office, GME office, or HR to give you full support, who can you trust? Well, for students and residents in the US, your school's Title IX office is a place that truly has your best interests in mind. I have only an N of 1 here, but the times in which I've needed to interact with our own Title IX office on behalf of students, which unfortunately has been more than once, I have been, if not impressed, at least satisfied with the concern and support for victims at our school. At the end of the day, there is only so much a Title IX office can do, but it's been my experience that what they can do, they will. Sometimes it's mistakenly claimed or believed that Title IX only applies to students, but as affirmed in the courts, I think in 2017 or so, Title IX also applies to interns and residents as well. The major downside to involving the Title IX office is that anything reported there will necessarily get escalated, which can carry a real risk of retaliation. For faculty and nurses and other non-trainee employees, there's not really any official person who is guaranteed to support you. There's no faculty version of the Title IX office. Academic institutions will have someone called the ombudsman, who is an individual sitting outside the institution's normal chain of command, who is not only empowered to, but is required to, provide you confidential information. Finding the right person for that role can be challenging, and not every institution has a wonderful ombudsman. And these people, even when they're great, they usually function more as a resource for information rather than as a resource for support, but it is better than nothing. Consider talking with a lawyer. Maybe all that's happened is you're occasionally subjected to sexually explicit jokes in the OR, and involving a lawyer seems total overkill. But if the harassment is either persistent and interfering with your ability to learn or to work, or if it's been formally reported to the institution and they've failed to act, or if you've experienced retaliation, and certainly if the harassment crosses the line into assault, I would recommend speaking with a lawyer that specializes in sexual misconduct, even if you don't think you want to pursue anything in court right now. In addition to documenting everything, there can be other important steps that are necessary to take as soon as possible after the incident or after the event that a lawyer could best advise you about. I don't know if this is a nationwide phenomenon, but at least here in Silicon Valley, there are lawyers who will do free, confidential, no obligation, 15-minute phone consultations to discuss a victim's various legal options after an incident of sexual harassment or assault. And this gets to the last point for victims, one I've sort of been dancing around. When should you report your harassment or assault? This is something that I can't generalize about. Every person's situation is different. Reporting a sexual predator will usually stop ongoing harassment of oneself, though not always. It will protect others down the road, usually, and it may provide a sense of justice if the perpetrator is eventually punished. However, and this is a big however, the risk of retaliation is real, particularly if the perpetrator is high up on the food chain. Theoretically, Title IX should protect students and residents from retaliation, and it's probably less common than it was 10 or 20 years ago, but it still happens. In the end, the decision of a victim to report or not is a profoundly personal one. The last thing I want to talk about in the video is advice for bystanders. That is, what should people do when they witness others being harassed? First, if they feel like they can, bystanders should either call attention to the behavior in real time, or if there's a significant power imbalance between those present, they can at the very least create a distraction. For example, if you are a student on rounds and you hear the attending make a sexually inappropriate comment about another student's appearance, you would be justified being concerned about retaliation, worried to tell that attending they're being a jerk. But there are often more subtle ways to interrupt the behavior. For example, you could overtly interrupt with an academic question related to whatever the topic or patient the attending is supposed to be talking about. This interrupts and stops the harassment at the moment, at least temporarily, without making the harasser overtly defensive. And if this is done to them multiple times, maybe they will take the hint without losing so much face as to give you a bad evaluation over it. The second important thing that bystanders can do is to check in with the victim afterwards. You don't need to counsel them per se, and if the person is not particularly close to you, you don't need to establish any kind of long-term ongoing emotional support per se. But just saying, hey, I saw what that person did to you. I'm so sorry that happened. It was completely inappropriate. Are you okay? Those four short sentences, they won't fix the problem, but it will help the victim to feel seen. And it's what I wish I had said to that fellow I witnessed being harassed by her attending 15 years ago. And the third important thing is, just like the victims, document the harassment that you see in case you are asked about it in a formal inquiry later on. I personally have given a deposition as a bystander in a sexual harassment case. I've known physicians who have been asked to testify at a grand jury. Having notes that you can refer to are immensely helpful. I so wish I didn't need to talk about sexual misconduct in medicine. I wish I didn't need to talk about it because it wasn't a thing. Or at the very least, I wish I didn't need to talk about it because institutions were proactive in having open and productive dialogue about it. However, even though it's not something that most people will encounter frequently, it is very much still a problem. Institutions don't want to talk about it because, it makes people uncomfortable. In addition, some senior faculty, and I don't mean to be flippant about this, but some senior faculty may be nervous about their own past behavior coming to light. And, it inevitably brings negative attention. Even if that negative attention would strengthen the institution in the long run. Anyway, that's all I have to say about this today. Feel free to post comments and questions, though keep in mind I am not a lawyer and cannot provide specific individualized advice about anyone's unique personal situation.